Imagine this. It's October 1962. The Cold War is at its absolute freezing point. You wake up one morning, turn on the news, and learn that Soviet nuclear missiles are being installed just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, in Cuba. They're aimed directly at major American cities: Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles. Millions of lives hang in the balance. This isn't a movie plot. This was the terrifying reality for 13 days that brought the world to the very edge of nuclear annihilation. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It all started on October 14th when an American U-2 spy plane, flying high over Cuba, captured shocking photographic evidence. There, clear as day, were launch sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles being constructed by the Soviet Union. When President John F. Kennedy was shown these photos, the gravity of the situation hit the White House like a tidal wave. The Soviets had secretly placed a dagger at America's throat. For the next 2 days, Kennedy and a small, hand-picked group of his most trusted advisors, known as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM, met in absolute secrecy. The options on the table were all terrifying. Should they launch a full-scale military invasion of Cuba? Or perhaps a surgical airstrike to destroy the missile sites before they became operational? Both options carried an immense risk. An attack on Cuba would almost certainly trigger a Soviet response, potentially escalating into an all-out nuclear war with Europe as the first battleground. The stakes couldn't be higher. The generals were pushing hard for military action. They saw it as a direct challenge to American strength. But Kennedy was hesitant. He'd read The Guns of August, a book about how World War I started through a series of miscalculations and escalations, and he was determined not to let history repeat itself on a nuclear scale. After days of intense, nail-biting debate, Kennedy chose a middle path. Not a direct attack, but something he called a quarantine. On the evening of October 22nd, he went on national television and revealed the crisis to a stunned American public and the world. He announced that the U.S. Navy would form a naval blockade around Cuba to stop any more Soviet ships from delivering military equipment. He was careful with his words, calling it a quarantine instead of a blockade, because a blockade is technically an act of war. He made it clear. Any attempt to breach the quarantine would be met with force, and he delivered a stark warning directly to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The launch of any missile from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. The world held its breath. The next few days were the most dangerous of the Cold War. American forces were placed on DEFCON 2, the highest level of military readiness, short of actual war. B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons were in the air 24/7, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Soviet ships were steaming towards the quarantine line. The question on everyone's mind was, would they stop? A confrontation at sea seemed inevitable. If the U.S. Navy fired on a Soviet vessel, World War III would likely begin right there in the Caribbean. This was the ultimate game of nuclear chicken, and neither side seemed willing to blink. Then, a breakthrough. Soviet ships carrying conventional weapons were allowed through, but those suspected of carrying missile components either slowed down or turned back. It was a small but crucial de-escalation. But the crisis was far from over. The missile sites in Cuba were still being worked on, racing towards operational status. While the world watched the naval standoff, a secret back channel was opened. A KGB agent and an ABC News reporter, acting as intermediaries, started passing messages between Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, and the Soviet ambassador. This was diplomacy in the shadows, a desperate attempt to find a solution away from the public posturing and military pressure. On Friday, October 26th, a long, rambling, and emotional letter arrived from Khrushchev. In it, he offered a deal. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised never to invade the island. It seemed like a way out. The mood in the White House was cautiously optimistic. But then, the very next morning, everything changed. A second, much harsher message came from Moscow, broadcast publicly. This time, the Soviets added a new demand. The U.S. must also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were just as close to the Soviet Union as the Cuban missiles were to the U.S. The White House was thrown into confusion. Which offer was the real one? Were they dealing with a divided Kremlin? Or was Khrushchev just raising the price? To make matters worse, that same day, a day that would be called Black Saturday, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. The generals were furious. They saw this as a deliberate act of war and demanded immediate retaliation. The pressure on Kennedy to launch an airstrike was immense. He was being pushed from all sides towards a military conflict that he knew would mean the end of the world as they knew it. This was the moment of maximum danger. The world was literally one button push away from nuclear Armageddon. But Kennedy held his nerve. In a stroke of diplomatic genius, his team decided to simply ignore the second, tougher letter. They would pretend it never arrived. Instead, they would publicly accept the terms of the first, more reasonable letter. Robert Kennedy was dispatched to meet secretly with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. He delivered the message. The U.S. publicly agreed to the non-invasion pledge. But he also delivered a secret, verbal promise on unofficial part of the deal. He confirmed that the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which were already obsolete and scheduled for removal anyway, would be taken out quietly a few months later. It was a crucial concession that allowed Khrushchev to save face. But there was also a threat, an ultimatum. If the Soviets didn't agree, by the next day, the U.S. would take military action. The deadline was set. The morning of Sunday, October 28th, arrived with agonizing tension. Then, at 9 a.m. Washington time, a message came over the radio from Moscow. Khrushchev had agreed. The Soviets would dismantle the missile sites in Cuba and ship them back to the Soviet Union under United Nations verification. In return, the U.S. formally pledged not to invade Cuba. The secret part of the deal, the removal of the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, was kept hidden from the public for years. The crisis was over. A collective sigh of relief was felt around the globe. Cities that had been targeted just hours before were safe. Families that had been preparing for the worst could finally breathe again. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a harrowing lesson in the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship. It showed how easily miscalculation, misunderstanding, and political pressure could lead to catastrophe. For 13 days, the fate of humanity rested on the decisions of a handful of leaders in Washington and Moscow. It was a terrifying glimpse into the abyss. In the aftermath, both superpowers, shaken by how close they had come to mutual destruction, took steps to ensure it would never happen again. A direct hotline was established between the White House and the Kremlin to allow for instant communication during a crisis. In the following year, they signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first major step towards controlling the nuclear arms race. The 13 days in October 1962 were a terrifying chapter in our history, but they also served as a stark reminder that in the nuclear age, the only way to win is to make sure the game is never played. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating and terrifying as I did, then make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. See you next time.